So I'm going to introduce our panel and then try to set the stage a little bit for this topic of inclusive capitalism. And then we're going to have a conversation and then, of course, open it up to you all to hear what your thoughts are. So starting on the far end for me is Lady Lynn Forrester de Rothschild. She's the founder and chief executive of the Coalition for Inclusive Capitalism. She's also a director of both The Economist newspaper and the Estee Lauder companies. Next to Lady Lynn is Professor George Serafeim, who is a professor of business administration at Harvard Business School, and he teaches the popular course Reimagining Capitalism, which is really sort of the much more rigorous version of what we're going to attempt to do in the next hour. Next to George is Mark Weinberger, who is currently the global chairman and chief executive of EY. He was the Assistant Treasury Secretary for Tax Policy under George W. Bush, and he currently serves on President Trump's Strategic and Policy Forum. Next to me is Steve Case, the chairman and CEO of Revolution. He and his wife, Jean, also established the Case Foundation. I was just talking to Steve about this before we came up. I graduated college in 1994, and so for my generation, Steve is really an iconic entrepreneur who defines what the internet was for many people of my generation. So this is a kind of funny moment for capitalism, because on the one hand, if we were to look at the entire world, I think you can say that it is capitalism's greatest moment of victory. As Larry Summers has said, we have just had the biggest reduction in global poverty in recorded history, largely because of capitalism and its spread, particularly in Asia, but also in South America and Africa. As Angus Deaton, the Nobel laureate, has said in a book he wrote called The Great Escape, which is about the great escape from poverty, which has been the norm for human societies for most of human history. Angus Deaton wrote, "Things are getting better and hugely so." If you want to read the very brief version of this, I recommend, and more importantly, Bill Gates recommends a book called Getting Better by Charles Kenny, which is highly readable. And it really just leaves no doubt that whatever measure you use, life, whether it's money, whether it's health, whether it's longevity, whether it's material living standards, life has gotten better over the last generation in a way that has virtually no precedent. And yet, and I know you all knew an and yet was coming, in much of the West, and Japan, which is to say the parts of the world that had already experienced this great leap in living standards, it doesn't at all feel like things are getting better and hugely so. The statistic that I find most shocking, really, comes from the Russell Sage Foundation, which is median net worth in this country, after adjusting for inflation, is 14% lower than it was in the mid-'80s. It's pretty remarkable. Over a 30-plus year period, the typical American family is less wealthy than it used to be. You probably are familiar with some other statistics about wage stagnation. Maybe most alarmingly, the statistics about what's happening to life expectancy for Americans without a college degree. And so this idea of inclusive capitalism is really an urgent topic. And think about both halves of that word. I don't see any alternative to capitalism that is going to provide rising living standards for large numbers of people. But capitalism, as we have had it in the West, has not been sufficiently inclusive. And that is leading to all kinds of anger. It's leading to all kinds of political flare-ups, whether it's President Trump's election, whether it's Brexit, whether it's stuff that's happening in any number of countries. Essentially, the demolition of the two long-standing parties in France, like that. So the question that we're here to talk about today is, how do we get inclusive capitalism? So with that slightly long wind-up, Steve, let me turn to you. How do you think of what the central challenge is for creating a more inclusive capitalism than we have?
I'd say there's two. I think the first is trying to rethink what capitalism is, reimagine what capitalism is, and move away from the view that was popularized a half a century ago by Milton Friedman and others, that businesses should focus exclusively on profit. Anything else is a distraction. I think there's a growing recognition, while profit has to be front and center, that companies, in addition to focusing on profit, also should focus on purpose. And the whole idea of, the whole realm of impact investing, which is getting a lot of momentum, we've done a lot of work on it at the Case Foundation, is an example of that. So that's one. The second, which is the one I'm mostly focused on, not surprisingly, coming from an entrepreneurial kind of background, is how do we level the playing field in terms of entrepreneurship? Because all those big companies out there start as small companies. They don't just imagine suddenly be Fortune 500 companies. They start as startups. So it's sort of the seed corn. And if you're getting more of those startups going in more sectors and with more people in more places, then 20 years from now, you'll have a different kind of economy, a different kind of communities. And on the entrepreneurship side, even though obviously we made progress and there are great things happening in Silicon Valley and other places, the data is pretty sobering. That last year, 75% of venture capital went to 3 states, California, New York, Massachusetts, which meant 47 states split 25%. So it does matter where you are. It's much easier to raise capital if you're in California than if you're in Colorado, even though Colorado's doing reasonably well. But it's actually worse if you dig beyond that. Last year, 90% of venture capital went to men. 10% went to women. Less than 1% went to African Americans. So while entrepreneurship is this path to innovate and create jobs and lift up communities, the reality, if you just look at the data, is the playing field is not level. It doesn't matter where you live. It doesn't matter what you look like. It doesn't matter who you know. And we need to figure out ways to be more inclusive. Otherwise, we're going to have a greater and greater divide, which is some of which we saw in this election. But the point I make to people is the election of Donald Trump, because a lot of people in a lot of parts of the country felt left out and left behind, it's because they were left out and left behind. If we're only backing the entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley, they're doing disruptive things that destroy jobs in the middle of the country. We're not offsetting that, at least in part, by backing the entrepreneurs in the middle of the country that can create jobs in the middle of the country. It's not going to end well. And so that's why this issue around inclusive entrepreneurship and regional entrepreneurship, we call Rise of the Rest, is so important.
I think it's a central point that whatever your politics are, right or left, there really is a rational reason for a lot of people to be angry. Right. Why, George, is this not kind of do-gooderism, right? Why, in the world that we have, if a company says, I mean, it'd be great if you could have it all, right? But there are trade-offs in the world, and why is it that if a company says, hey, I'm making an 8% return, I'm going to give up that extra percentage point or two in order to make the world a better place? Why isn't that firm just going to kind of shrivel up given the capitalist forces of competition that we have?
Let me first say, and David, this is a great question, but let me first say that what we now have in terms of evidence and research, we have a body of evidence that suggests that actually companies, purpose-driven companies that invest in their employees, that invest in product quality and safety, that actually improve their environmental performance and so forth, actually are better performing companies. So we now accumulate a lot of evidence that organizations that build purpose in their organization actually are better performing organizations. That being said, there are trade-offs, and sometimes you hit the wall. And what I always say to my students in every class that I teach is that you can take as a business executive the world as given, or you can change the world and shape the competitive landscape in a way that works for you. What we find right now, and I think that's very critical, in order for us not to stop with the institutions that we have, but actually to form the institutions that we want to have, is actually we need to recognize that we need much more collaboration in the world, much more collaboration at the industrial level between competitors within industries. We need much more collaboration at the regional level, everything that's happening in Detroit, everything that's happening in Minneapolis and so forth, but also kind of like at the nation level. And we need to start working much more between sectors, between the educational sector and the private sector, the companies, between governments and companies and so forth, between the foundations as well and the private sector. I think by doing that, what we're managing to do is eliminate some of those trade-offs. You eliminate some of those trade-offs because you make actually pre-competitive what is the right thing to do, not only for your business, but actually for the communities, for the nation overall. And that is something that it was completely, I would say, almost like a blasphemy, right, with traditional economic thinking that basically said, put your head down, institutions are the way they are, and just compete. And now what we're trying to do is actually reframe that and say, well, actually we can move to a better equilibrium by not taking the world as given. And I'm sure Mark and Lynn will talk about that, but actually, for example, reframing about what we measure, what we value in markets, right? And by doing that, we can actually change capital allocation decisions. We can fuel the impact investing markets. We can actually fuel better working practices and so forth. So that collaboration aspect is something that we really need to push forward.
Lynn, you've obviously devoted so much of your work to this idea of inclusive capitalism. What is inclusive capitalism to you? And maybe most sharply, how does it differ in the biggest ways from what we have today?
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you to everyone for coming to a panel on inclusive capitalism. I would have thought you would have to call it 50 Shades of Inclusive Capitalism to get a crowd like this. So I am very, very appreciative. Thank you. Thank you so much. Inclusive capitalism is an oxymoron to those people, David, who you said, and Steve, you said, actually they were left out. But inclusive capitalism is simply the idea that our economic system has to work for each person, for everybody. And it's clearly not working, whether it's the statistics David gave or the statistics from Edelman on trust. We know that in our society, many people do not feel like the system works for them. So the movement toward inclusive capitalism, of course, it entails impact investing, corporate social responsibility, the philanthropy of so many of you, of Bill Gates, the American. That's all great, but fundamentally, we have to make sure that our system is working. And the movement toward inclusive capitalism is really nothing less than a complete reform of the capital markets. The capital markets can change the world. And capitalism has changed over time. Capitalism of 1890 was not the same as capitalism in 1920 or 1940 or 1980 or 2015. But let's go back to the capitalism of the 1940s, which I think is epitomized by the statement that is still engraved in granite in the lobby of Johnson & Johnson by the founder of Johnson & Johnson. Our first obligation is to the doctors, nurses, and patients who we serve. We must give them proper products. Our second obligation is to the great employees who produce those. Our third obligation is to the community in which we live. And our fourth obligation is to provide a fair return to shareholders. Now, that was in the 40s, and that was when Peter Drucker was telling us about management. And then, as Steve mentioned, Milton Friedman came along and said the sole corporate social responsibility of a corporation is ... to make a profit for its shareholders. Then Jensen and Meckling came along and they said the theory, they proposed the theory of the firm, which is still the theory that we are operating under today, and that's what I believe we need to start rethinking. What did they say? The shareholder owns the company, the shareholder's the principal. Management is the agent of that principal. Management's duty is to do what that principal wants, and that principal wants maximization of their economic interests. That was the theory that most CEOs have functioned under. And without saying that there's a direct causation, there's certainly a correlation between that theory in the 1980s to right now, where average stock is held for 4 months. In the 1960s, it was 8 years. Average CEO pay in the 80s was 40 times worker. Average S&P CEO pay to worker today is 335 times. All these things have happened in the context of this concept of capitalism. So isn't it time for us to realize that it's not sustainable, that we were probably pretty surprised with the Trump vote, but I agree with Steve, what you said to people. Yeah, the people who were pissed off had a lot of reason to be pissed off. And it is definitely in our interest, either morally or because it's not sustainable and it's not going to last, to change it. So what does inclusive capitalism say? Inclusive capitalism also understands that there are a few CEOs in the world who will rise up and do the right thing for the broad set. Not a few, there are many. There's Alex Gorski at J&J, who still is that way, Paul Pullman, Indra Nooyi, Mark Weinberger, Tom Wilson here. There are the CEOs who do it, but we can't expect the CEOs to do it if the capital markets crush them. So how much credit do you think Nelson Peltz gave to Jeff Immelt for saying he was going to train 125,000 employees to be employees for the future. I don't think he gave them too much credit. Maybe you saw American Airlines a few weeks ago announce they were going to accelerate their compensation agreement with their flight attendants and increase wages now rather than in 3 years. Almost every analyst that was covering them said this is a theft from the shareholders. So if a CEO does not have the backing of the asset managers to understand that these movements within the companies that train their people, the movements that take care of their supply chain, movements that take care of the community are actually long-term value creators, like the work that George is doing at Harvard to prove, you can't prove, again, a causation, but you can prove a correlation, then we're not going to get there. So we work with the world's largest asset owners, asset managers, and some of the great corporations to try to get to a place where I'm going to let Mark finish. But the last point I want to make is that this is not starting from scratch. People have thought about this for a long time. And one person who is a member of our coalition is Hiro Mizuno, who is the chief investment officer for the Japanese pension, $1.4 trillion. It's the largest pool of capital in the world. He was hired personally by President Abe with the direction to reform the capital markets. We want our money to reflect our values. And it's not only up at the top level where this is of interest. It's also one of our members of our coalition told me a story. They had a town hall meeting with the members of the pension plan that they manage. And this woman stood up. She was 35 years old. She's a teacher. And she said, "You manage my money. You work for me. And my instruction to you is to invest in companies that are creating the kind of world that I want to retire into." And so both from the bottom up, people, consumers, they can articulate a belief that companies that do the right thing by their people, by their products, by the planet, are more desirable, and also, as George's research shows, more valuable.
This is the right place to be talking about all the...
And then I just want to, can I pass it to Mark?
Yes, and just one sec, Mark, I'm going to turn to you. I'm struck because that Johnson & Johnson slogan that you talk about is in the same post-war period that Walter Paepke founded this institute. So it seems like it's really interesting to think about when the country came out of the war and had this notion of we're all in it together, of national mission. There was much more of a sense that business does have this larger responsibility.
But there's also a book, if you're interested in this, by Roger Martin called Fixing the Game, where he compares the performance, the stock performance of J&J to GE under Jack Welch, who was the maximization shareholder value guru, who a few years ago said it's the dumbest idea in the world. But Martin proves in that book how Johnson & Johnson, granted they had some blips, nobody's perfect, outperformed.
Mark, I guess what I wanted to ask you is, I do worry about the trade-offs here, right? Which is when they close the door, take the American Airlines example that Lynn gave. The fact is that giving bigger raises to the employees does come from somewhere. And so at EY, you have insight into so many businesses. How can this work in a way, it's a version of the question I asked George, but how can this work in a way so that when the doors close and businesses are making decisions, A, they can see this as being in their interest, and B, it is in their interest.
So, so you set up the problem beautifully with three people talking about it, and you asked me to fix it. That's not exactly true.
Well, isn't that what your daily life is like as a CEO?
Put the big button.
You sound like my 4 kids, but excuse me, I get all choked up over this. Let me add 2 more important data points before I jump to that. I don't think it's that business or politicians don't care, and that's why we're in the position we are. We have structural, fundamental changes going on in the world in capitalism, where, to Steve's point, it's being concentrated much more not just in a few states, but in frankly, it's shifting around the world. And it's shifting now where you can create a lot of capital with no workers. I mean, we're seeing some of the highest asset valued companies, an Airbnb now more highly valued than a Hilton Hotel, or a Google more valued than a GE, with a tenth the workforce. We're seeing a situation also, you outlined correctly, that poverty has gone down in the world, but it's more increased in income inequality in each country. And what's happening is today, if you're in the United States or most developed country, we're all facing the same issue, which is that 30% of all the people alive today, 90% of the people under 30 live in an emerging market. In 1995, 18 of the global Fortune 500 were headquartered in an emerging market. Today, there's 157. The wealth is shifting back to some other parts of the world with technology, which is allowing you to do, a young person in Africa can operate around the world today and is going to compete against US for jobs. And technology, we have increased manufacturing in the United States threefold over the last 20 years, but we're doing it with a third the workers. And these are fundamental changes, and we're saying, well, trade's the problem. Immigration's the problem. Wrong. Trade grows the global economy and the US economy. 95% of the world's consumers sit outside the United States of America, 80% of GDP growth. If we try and cut back trade, we're going to suffer. Immigration helps make us stronger, not weaker, right? So we got to focus on the right issues. What this effort that we're talking about is trying to say corporations also have to focus on the right issues. Interestingly enough, today, when you look at a company's balance sheet, only 16% of the assets show up on the balance sheet. In the 1970s, when our standards were created, 80% of the assets sat on a balance sheet. Today, your brand, your human capital, your intangibles don't show up anywhere. And yet, every Fortune 500 company that Lynn mentioned is usually valued more on their quarterly financials. And Steve, you had to go this for a long time. And you're going to, if you hit or miss your quarterly financials by a penny, it's going to be more impactful on the value of your company in the markets than whether you're training your workforce. In fact, if I spend $100 on robots or $100 on a building, I increase the value of my company. I create an asset. If I spend $100 on training my workforce, I decrease the value of my company because it's an expense, and I don't get any credit for it. So we haven't updated the way we think about what value is in these businesses and how everything is shifting with these structural changes. So what we're trying to do, and to your point, and you said it well, George, I mean, we have 250,000 people in 150 plus countries around the world. And when we instituted our purpose of building a better world and talked about giving our 70% of our people who are millennials the opportunity to help solve clients' biggest problems, not be great tax accountants, lawyers, M&A experts, and everything else, and talk about the value proposition, our engagement went up, our retention went up, our earnings went up, and our growth accelerated past the rest of the profession. And it is clear there's a tangible evidence when you do these things that George is talking about, that Lady Lynn has put on the table, it works. But the only thing we measure is quarterly financials. So what we're trying to do is say, how do you measure longer term value so that the asset owners and investors, if I'm a CEO and I think I'm creating value, but no investor does, it doesn't matter because my share price is going down. So we've gotten together $20 trillion worth of assets, investors and managers, along with companies, and we're saying, let's work together to figure out how we can come up with additional indicia of value beyond just historical quarterly financials that aren't really reflective of value anymore. And it is looking at your human capital. It is looking at your supply chain, your effect on the environment. It is looking at a whole bunch of things that we know younger investors and our employees want us to focus on.
You going to come in?
Yeah, I think a bunch of different parts here. First of all, though, this issue of long-termism versus short-termism is important. And there are a lot of people who are, a lot of entrepreneurs who are reluctant to go public because of the concern that they will not have the flexibility to invest. There's some exceptions that have done that well. Obviously, Amazon and Google are great examples where they set up expectations early on that they were going to be investing over the long run. But most companies are worried that they'll get trapped into this quarterly dynamic. So I do think the work Mark and others are doing is going to be very important. There's also a new company that's being launched called the Long-Term Stock Exchange as an alternative to New York Stock Exchange or NASDAQ that some companies will then match with some investors. And I hope things like that will take off. But the other dynamic here I want to make sure we really dig into is there's sometimes a perception that, and you even suggested it, that the focus on this broader purpose or this focus on being more inclusive somehow is sacrificing profit and effectiveness. And that's just not true. Yep. Some examples of companies we backed at Revolution, a company called Shinola in downtown Detroit, started 5-6 years ago, has thousands of employees, a couple $100 million kind of business growing quite rapidly, and people are buying $700 watches because they love the story of Shinola trying to help rebuild Detroit and taking unemployed, displaced auto workers and retraining them to make watches. That's why people are buying those watches. If those same watches were made in China, they wouldn't be selling for $700, and it wouldn't be a success. So that's a case where the purpose, the impact actually is driving the growth. Another one we invested in, a company called Revolution Foods, is focused on school lunches and done hundreds of millions of lunches, started by two moms 10 years ago saying the lunches in most schools is terrible and that's bad for obesity, bad for learning outcomes. That's another significant company, Benefit Corporation, start every board meeting talking about their impact before they go into their profit. And they are growing in part because that is resonating with people. So, and similarly, on the regional entrepreneurship, there's often this sense of, Steve, isn't it, it's so nice of you to be backing these entrepreneurs in the middle of the country, because of course, all the really successful entrepreneurs are going to be on the coast. And so it's sort of a kind of a do-gooder thing. It's not a do-gooder thing. The valuations in those rise and rest cities are lower. I'm going to make more money. Meanwhile, the expertise in those cities in ag tech, I'm betting on the folks in like St. Louis and Louisville and Lincoln who understand farming. Health tech, I'm betting on Baltimore, where Johns Hopkins is, or Cleveland, where Cleveland Clinic is, where there's a lot of expertise around these things. So this isn't done like I think it is the right thing to do. I do think we need to level the playing field. I think we do need to be more inclusive. I think we do need to create jobs everywhere. But the reason we're backing companies like Shinola in Detroit and trying to figure out ways to unleash entrepreneurs all over the country is it also is a way to generate great returns on our investments, because the capital markets aren't working and most of the capital is focusing on the coast, and there are great opportunities, great entrepreneurs in their communities. And most of you are not from the coast, I'm guessing. I would just encourage you, I'm sure some of you are doing this already, to double down on backing your entrepreneurs in your community, whether it be directly with funds, maybe angel networks, or maybe there's regional micro VC funds that are popping up around the country. That's a great way to support your community, because if you are backing more startups and some of those end up becoming speed ups and some of those end up becoming iconic Fortune 500 companies, that's probably the best thing you can do for your community versus anything you might be doing philanthropically.
It reminds me of some of the conversations we've had at the festival this week about family policy with companies. Whatever company actually figures out a way to get women who've taken time off to have kids and raise kids back into the workforce in a productive way, wow, is that company going to have an enormous competitive advantage.
Why is that so difficult to figure out?
I don't know why it is, but the fact is that companies aren't doing it, right? Companies are not doing it. If you look at what happened.
David, let me give you an example. Just to punctuate your point. So in 2000, our percentage retention of men was 15 percentage points higher than women. This past year, for the first time in our history, our women retention is 0.2 higher than men. And it goes to your issue. If you look at 40% of the families today who are working are either single wage owner or two wage earners. And the women has the responsibility still primarily in society to take care of the children. They're choosing to work or take care of their kids. We provide 16 weeks of paid parental leave for men and women and other things like that. Flexibility that we've talked a lot about. You can do it. It has showed up in our bottom line tremendously. And when you retain more workers, they're more proud to work with you. They stay longer. You're better off. There's evidence. Harvard's done a lot of great work on this that shows exactly what you're saying.
Lady Lynn and Mark, can you talk to us about the Embankment Project? You sort of just alluded to it, but can you talk about this effort that you've just announced this week to try to get us better data about what companies are really doing?
Okay, so we sort of laid out where we think we should go with inclusive capitalism. And the fact that many CEOs, and in fact many asset managers, want to measure and value those things. But what is the big problem? You can't manage what you can't measure. So the Coalition for Inclusive Capitalism has put together 20 of our largest asset owners, asset managers, and companies to work with a framework that EY has committed fantastic amount of resources to developing a framework where all three of those people in the value chain can agree that these metrics are either valuable or they're not valuable, and agree on standardization of the questions regarding employee sales force. Because right now what happens, even companies that do these things, they put out a nice shiny report on how their employees feel about them or what they're doing. And either it's never read or it's so loosey-goosey that no portfolio manager at BlackRock or Fidelity is going to invest in that. So the Embankment Project is a first step among these 20 people, like Mark said, representing $20 trillion of assets under management, to see if there is a framework that can be agreed upon for that purpose. So we can give people the tool to manage. And then, therefore, the thesis is that if investors understand the value of these actions, their stock price will be reflected in their stock price. And it also will be the fulfillment of a company's license to operate that society gives them. Did
Mark,
I say
do you
that
wanna add
right?
anything?
Well, I would just say this is the Holy Grail, and we will likely fail. But
Make progress.
it is a hugely
We'll go
worthwhile
down trying.
effort of the CEOs of some of the biggest companies in the world, not just the United States, coming together saying, listen, help us. Help us explain to investors why our quarterly profits aren't the only thing they should be focused on, how our research matters for the longer term, how our investment in the environment helps the society. If we don't have that, then they're going to constantly beat us up, and there's going to be some activist somewhere that's going to come in and make a better case for how they can bump our stock with share buybacks and dividends. At the same time, we have investors telling us, listen, we want to make these decisions on how well you treat your workers, how valuable you are, whether you have purpose, but we have no way to compare across an industry how well you're doing versus someone else. We get your propaganda in your annual reports, but it could be all fluff. So we're trying to, they're all saying, help us do this. So we're trying to step into this gap. We're going to get them all the tables, and we're going to work for 18 months. We're going to try and help them do that. You know, will it be hard? Absolutely, it's going to be hard because these are intangibles. But you said it well, and Steve, you know this from running a big business. If you don't measure it, it's very hard to get it in large organizations. So if you only measure quarterly financials and everything else is just a paragraph, you will get quarterly financial analysis. So we're trying to expand that analysis to other things, work with standard setters. That's the journey we're on.
To me, one of the most important parts
Can
of
I
it is
touch on
the.
this just 1 second, because
Yeah.
this is really important for multiple reasons, this project. Back in 2010, we did a study that we presented at the National Bureau of Economic Research and a bunch of other places. And that study received a lot of attention because we showed that organizations that have some of those measurements internally, and they are able to measure customer attributes, employee engagement, and kind of like CO2 emissions, water, and so forth, they actually outperform. But actually, nobody paid attention to what I thought it was the most interesting result of the study, which is that most organizations don't even have that data internally, actually. Probably Mark knows that very, very well. But I actually don't think that many people know that. Most organizations, even well-managed organizations, large organizations, don't even have that data internally. What does this tell you? A couple of things. First of all, there is probably an opportunity for better management of resources, right? So there is a lot of value creation that can happen. The second thing is that implicitly, we have structured a business environment where actually people don't value as much human capital and natural capital and so forth as they're managing and as they're valuing financial capital, that they are developing very good, actually, financial measures, but actually they're not measuring anything else. And then the third thing that we found in a separate study, and to me that goes to really the core of the issue that we're discussing here, is we actually try to understand the extent to which employees inside organizations get a sense of meaning and purpose when they go to the job. And what we found, collecting data for about 500,000 employees in the United States, we found that that sense of meaning and purpose at work drops dramatically as you go lower in organizations. So as you move from senior executives to middle management and then to lower level employees, people get completely disengaged. Actually, Mark doesn't know that, but one of the organizations that we have in the data is Ernst & Young, and that is one of the flattest organizations where Mark and his lower level employees actually feel the same sense of purpose. I think, to me, that goes to the core of the issue. We need to bridge that gap. There is an inequality in terms of life and meaning every day that you wake up. So we need to actually really understand what is causing this. And what is causing this, in my opinion, to a certain extent, is that we have completely separated, for the past 50 years, business and what do you do for financial performance from the set of values and purpose inside workplaces. We need to actually do something about that.
And I think there's an interesting opportunity this year. And everybody here should try to figure out that maybe they could play some role to move the ball forward, because this whole issue of tax reform opens the hood on some of these issues. I was in a meeting last week at the White House. They're focused on simplifying things and lowering rates and so forth. But the point I made is you also need to have a bias towards this long-term kind of performance, a bias towards job creation. So maybe, for example, the carried interest should be different if it's a hedge fund that holds a stock for 2 seconds versus a venture fund that holds it for 10 years. Maybe there should be more incentives around job creation. Mark mentioned this, but there was a company called WhatsApp was sold for $20 billion and it had like 20 employees. 20 years ago, you need 20,000 employees to be worth $20 billion. So maybe there is a benefit to society, a benefit to communities to have companies that are creating wealth but also creating jobs. So what are the incentives? If we go too far towards simplification, lowering rates, it could actually exacerbate more of the short-termism. And why should I focus on these broader issues in terms of jobs? So getting the discussion more in the broader context, yes, the tax code is too complicated. Yes, it should be simplified, not arguing that. But as it relates to some of these issues, simplification may work against trying to incent the right kind of behaviors.
Mark, what do you think about that? Given the jobs that both your current job but also your past job at Treasury, what to you are the most important principles of tax reform?
I think E&Y likes complexity.
No, I gladly give up a lot of our work for a simplified tax system, because then the economies grow more, then we hire more people, then more people hire us. It's awesome. I think the biggest, yeah, Steve, you're right. I mean, you got to do away where you tilt against where the global economy is going. But I would say Washington is not really good at figuring out and administering social policies through the tax system. And we found that out. Either people take advantage of it too much, some people don't understand it, gets very complicated, they pay us a lot of money, it doesn't add value to the economy. So I would say lower the rates. What's really different, I talked about this global economy. It didn't matter. No one talked about tax reform for 30 years. Now it's really back in the center stage. Why? Because you heard of these things called inversions. All these U.S. companies that were moving their headquarters overseas, and then they were being taxed by the presidents by saying they're un-American. Let me tell you, no CEO wakes up in the morning and says, I got great news. I'm going to move my whole company to London or to France or someone else out of the United States. Worst decision they have to make. They're doing it because they can't compete in the global economy with our tax system. So we got to get a more competitive international system that will create jobs, lower the rates, more simple, more competitive internationally. And I would argue that we want to get it out of social engineering, get rid of all the deductions, incentives, and credits that were put for good reason in the code and just never get taken away after their useful lifetime. And I think that would help a real lot to grow the global economy.
So let's open it up to you all. Let's get some microphones starting to circle. The one thing I guess I'd like to say about the Embankment Project is I think that what strikes me as so important is this idea of apples to apples data, right? Because Lady Lynn, you were saying this, Mark, you were saying it, that for investors, for potential employees, for rivals, for journalists, for academic experts, we all get this, I forget one of you used the word propaganda, right? We all get these reports, but you don't exactly know which companies are walking the walk and which ones are just talking the talk. So yeah. I'm excited about this.
Oh, good.
Okay, where do we have microphones? Let's see, can we get one right back here, ma'am? There's one over there.
Thank you very much. Really inspiring. This idea has been kicking around, though, for a very long time, and there have been promising starts in the past that at least I've lost track of where they've gone, and I'd be interested to know whether in your coalitions around various things, the Embankment Project and so on, are you collaborating with organizations like the Global Reporting Initiative, which actually had a promising start on verifiable metrics for non-tangible assets of the kind you were talking about? How is the FASB involved and so on?
Yeah, so I'll start with that. So yes, we have a representative on SASB on the International Integrated Reporting Council, which is a global organization looking at this. I'm part of the FTLC organization, which is a bunch of companies looking at this. Whatever we come up with in our Embankment Project is open source. It's not going to be inclusive capital. It's not going to be EY. It's contribution to the common knowledge. What I found often is when a problem becomes so big, it becomes paralyzing. So what we said is we want to peel off, get like-minded asset owners, managers, and companies to come together and just look very specifically at a couple of things. We're looking at 2 or 3 industries, that's it. And we're saying what would be, using the data. George referenced it, David referenced it. Today, the difference between 20 years ago is we can get unstructured data from everywhere. What Google or somebody is saying your employees are saying out there, what Glassdoor is saying about pull it all together, and you can predict where there's going to be a fraud or where there's bad morale and how that affects overall performance. And that wasn't possible years ago. So we're trying to be discreet, pilot project, 2 or 3 industries, come up with some things, build off that with the larger organizations. We're definitely aligned.
Lady Lynn, you want to add anything?
No, just to say that we are going to be completely data-driven, and we're working with the practitioners instead of theoretical. And we're not going to accept to sort of check the box. The people who are making, EY is committing 20 people to this within their organization. Every one of the 20 people involved is giving a full-time person. So we're not a conclusion looking for the data to support it. If the practitioners actually say, this is too hard, this is not going to be something I can use, we will admit that. But if it's something they think we can use, then we're going to go to FASB and SASB and GRI and integrated reporting, because we stand on the shoulders of all of their work. We don't pretend that this is completely unique to us. What is unique is getting these groups at the CEO level to say, yes, let's test this. It's going to all be confidential. We want everybody to be as open and honest and brutal as they can be. That's the only thing I would say.
Thank you. Okay.
Glenn McDonald. Steve, you mentioned B corporations, and I was wondering if you and Mark and the entire panel can comment on why more corporations can't follow the example of Unilever and become a B corporation. And for Lynn and George, is that a framework for equity analysts to be retrained on how they evaluate companies?
So for those who don't know, the B corporations are benefit corporations where the governance, there's C corporation, S corporation, and now B corporation. And essentially it's set up where the governance of the company, the board, has responsibilities not just to maximize profit, but to consider other factors. The reason it's still relatively limited is a relatively new phenomenon, really the last decade, in some states really the last few years. So there's some big companies, Unilever I think gets a lot of credit for really kind of leading the pack on this, and as Lynn referenced, they actually, there was a little bit of a swirl a few months ago where there was this potential hostile bidder that actually, I think, backed off in part because they realized, and maybe Warren Buffett as one of their investors encouraged them to back off, that they had this broader mission and it wasn't going to be evaluated like many other kind of hostile takeovers might. So actually, they backed off as a result. I think you'll see more and more of those companies, kind of both the large companies adopting, B Corp status, and much more in terms of young companies embracing that from the get-go. And I think it also ties in with some trends, demographic trends. If you talk to young people, some call the millennials, the data is pretty compelling that they want to work for companies that stand for more than profit, also purpose. They want to do business with companies that stand for more than profit, and they want to invest in companies that stand for more than profit. So having that profit impact is going to help you attract and retain employees, help you attract and retain customers, and help you attract and retain investors. And that's why it's a phenomenon that I think will build a lot of momentum over the next decade.
So real quick anecdote to answer your question from my perspective is why it's not happening. And this is a CEO who will go unnamed, who was in a meeting I was in just yesterday. And this CEO is on the board of directors of a company, a CEO of a company, and is running a massive equity investment fund and as an investor. And he said, you know what, it's kind of interesting. As a CEO, I talk a lot about how our employees are, safety, engagement. As a board of directors, I oversee that. I focus on it a lot. As an investor, I never ask about it. I only ask about what's their financials. Until we get the investors to put their money where their mouth is and say that they're not only interested in it, but they take those actions. And that's why the investors are saying, help us get there, help us figure out what we should be looking at. That's what this project's about. Until we get them to think, the CEO, the investor to think the same way, it's going to be hard to get any of these companies to do it.
Thank you for this question. First of all, we should clarify that a B Corp from a benefit corporation are two different things. A public benefit corporation is a separate legal entity that requires a different registration and so forth. If we're talking about B Corps, I think that's kind of like a certification from the B Lab. That is a much easier thing to do compared to changing your legal form completely. And actually, we don't have that many examples as of yet of companies changing completely their legal form. So it's too early to tell. I want to touch on one thing that I think it's important, and Judy, actually, Samuelson here has done a lot of work with the Business and Society program, that there is a misperception. And it's important for us to understand that this is a misperception and this is not true. which says that actually corporate law here in the United States, but in other jurisdictions as well, says that you need to maximize shareholder value. That is actually not true, which means that even if you are any type of corporation, the duties of the board of directors are to the corporation itself. So what I always say is that you can be a purpose-driven company as long as you're doing stuff that are in the long-term benefit of the corporation. You're fine, and you can have purpose in any organization that you work. Because one of the things that I'm worried about is that we actually create institutions that end up excluding people instead of including people. And saying, well, if you actually go and work for Goldman Sachs or for Procter & Gamble, you're not that impact-oriented. No, that's actually not true. You can have tremendous impact by working on those organizations. So I think there is a menu of solutions, and I think things like big corps and fantastic innovations. But there is a menu of options, and business leaders can choose what works for them.
So what I would say to that is that there is a very dangerous unintended consequence of that good idea. And the unintended consequence is that it becomes a silo. It's the same thing I'm worried about with ESG funds, with impact investing. Everything should be impact investing. It shouldn't be one area. And I'll tell you where this really was very clear to me. When, in fact, the Embankment Project was developed, it was one of our coalition meetings. Thankfully, Mark was there. It was Paul Pullman was hosting. And it was 10 days after the Kraft Heinz, offer, whatever they want to say. But remember, he got it on a Friday, and it was shut down by Sunday. And it really didn't matter that Paul Pullman was such a giant. But we were with him a week later. And what he said was that the Dutch, remember he's Dutch, it's a half Dutch, the Dutch had put Unilever into their ESG bucket because they're such a fine organization doing all these things. As a result, because he could only be a fraction of their investment, the big fund wasn't ESG. So he had less money out of the Dutch pension fund because he was categorized that way. That is very bad. That's going to slow everything down. That's why I say what inclusive capitalism has to be is a complete reform of the financial markets.
We had another question right in the same area. Right here.
Brent Science, thank you for the presentation. It's been great. It's been exciting to hear the different types of ways that inclusiveness can be created. The one that I can't kind of shake is jobs. And it seems to me, as far as jobs are concerned, I think that entrepreneurship, innovation, I think there's a lot of ways that we can improve this, but things seem to fall into three different categories. One is where you're losing net jobs. There's an innovative disruption, I think, of the driverless cars that can disrupt a lot of industries. Then the other is that there's kind of a net no increase, no decrease. It's just really displacing from one place to another. And the third is that you're going to improve it. Usually I think through productivity gains. I guess the question is, do you think that there's, frankly, I guess two questions are related. One, do you think there's enough meaningful of a third amount where you can create net increase in jobs? And the second is, are there things that the government or whoever can do to improve the amount of those types of opportunities out there?
Thank you.
Let me start with that one if I could. I think it's an outstanding question. We had a good breakfast discussion in another group I was in this morning about this. I think the job market for the United States and the world overall is going to change quite dramatically. Not only because millennials think differently and all that we hear and think, but the whole idea of a gig economy where you go get a car for Uber and you rent it, you don't have it be your full-time car or an Airbnb, and that's what's happening in the workforce. The percentage of workers who are independent contractors, the percentage of workers who are broken down now to not jobs but tasks, because computers are doing more and more tasks. They're not replacing jobs, but they're doing more and more parts of jobs, freeing people up to do different and other things. And more people don't want to be tied to a single employer for their entire life. And more people who are 60 and above want to continue to work but aren't going to work full time. So we're seeing this whole, we have a thing called Gig Now at EY where we're pulling together all these different independent contractors, putting them in a database, lining them up with job opportunities for them to continue to work. But it won't be necessarily with an employee-employer relationship. this raises the questions that you put on the table and Steve referred to earlier, which is right now most health benefits, most benefit for retirement come from your employer. How do you design a system for this future workforce, which is pretty unstoppable? Most people predict that by 2025, 30% of the workforce will be contingent workers, like we're seeing in other parts of the economy. We have to rethink the way we provide benefits and healthcare and everything else if that's going to be our new society. And government has a huge role to play in it. And there are certain people, and Judy, and you mentioned before, has done a great job here at Aspen working on that. Senator Mark Warner, Lady Lynn and I have worked with. The Democrat from Virginia has done a great job in this. They're starting just now to think about those issues.
I think more broadly, it's one of the big debates now, and even this week, in terms of are we going to have this jobless future, automation, robotics, artificial intelligence, driverless cars and trucks is going to destroy tens of millions of jobs. And I think there are different debates about the pace at which that will happen, but clearly there'll be a lot of job disruption, a lot of job loss. I think the only question is, can we offset that by some job creation? And I'm a little more optimistic than some, because I know the data that 200 years ago, over 90% of us worked on farms, and because of automation, now less than 2% of us work on farms. But we went on from that agricultural revolution to create the industrial revolution, which created a lot of jobs, and then more recently this technology revolution that created a lot of jobs. So we have to figure out what the next revolution is to create a lot of jobs, and my bet is we're going to be more likely to do that if we have a more inclusive approach to entrepreneurship. It goes back to what I was saying before, trying to find entrepreneurs from different backgrounds in different places that might have the big breakthrough idea in terms of some different kind of services that might get delivered. And maybe we'll fail, and maybe we'll have to go to universal basic income or other kind of safety nets. That's becoming more and more discussion. But let's at first try. And we have several of us happened to be at a conference, I guess 6 months ago at the Vatican with the Pope, and he said something that I think is very important to remember, which is jobs is not just about income, it's about dignity and purpose. So we have to do everything we can to create as many jobs for the future in as many places in our country and indeed around the world, and really kind of go all in on that. And if only then, if we fail, figure out, okay, what's plan B? But let's don't go to plan B too quickly, because I think we have a shot at making plan A work.
That's my central concern about universal basic income. I understand it's getting lots of attention right now, but to me, the dignity issue with work, it is. And there are no guarantees, but the historical norm is that jobs aren't going to disappear, right? Just as you said.
I would just argue, the one thing you got to remember, the only thing I would argue, I agree with that, but they're starting to relocate to the bigger populations in the world that are outside the U.S. So they will be moving to Africa and India, with now you can do much more electronically, and they won't be coming back to the Midwest. And so we got to think about what that means.
But they won't be coming back, but maybe there are other jobs. You mentioned before the depreciation issue. If Jeff Immelt could have depreciated his 125,000 people he put into training, maybe there would have been a different outcome. So this is where government has got to be part of the solution. It's the biggest issue out there.
We have time for one more quick one. Anyone have a quick one? Right here, please. So the question, for those of you who couldn't hear, was what about education? I'll just tee it up by saying, if you've listened to me on panels here before, I recommend this book. I would say 1 out of every 4 panels I'm on. The Race Between Education and Technology by Claudia Golden and Larry Katz really is the best single framework I've seen for it. And just think about the title. It's exactly what your question is, which is, this is a race between our skills, our education, and technology.
Maybe I'll say something a little contrarian, particularly from a tech background, which I think we may be at peak coding. A lot of the jobs in the future are going to be coding, and people have that expertise, a passion, a understanding, a desire for that should go into that. But a lot of other jobs are going to have other skills, including some of the liberal arts skills. I think in this future, this next wave of innovation, partnerships are going to be very important. Not going to be about the software and the app. If you really want to revolutionize healthcare, it's connecting with doctors and working with hospitals, and it's true with a lot of different sectors. So those skills around, kind of coalition building partnerships are going to be, very important. So I think the key from education, making sure we're teaching, kids to do the things that machines can't do, and some of those are going to be in this area of creativity and thinking out of the box and being able to work with people in collaborative, kinds of ways. So course coding is important, but I think we've too many people just jump to that as like the be-all, end-all solution.
Any final thoughts?
Yeah, I would do that. I think you're right. I think digital and data will be a competency, not an end game, and it's all people need to learn it. But I would say one other thing. We do have, we haven't innovated the education institution like the rest of the world has. You're exactly right. but we also haven't changed to match the skill gap, our views of where the jobs are. There's 16 million jobs through 2025 in the non-professional space that we have gaps all over on in terms of apprenticeship and 2-year colleges that are incredibly good, $100,000 a year, $75,000 a year jobs across the United States. Somehow we don't value those. If you're not a doctor or a lawyer, if you're not an accountant, well, somehow you didn't make it in the world. We got to change that mentality because there's a lot of jobs out there that aren't being filled in that really important space.
I get to see the end of the education spectrum, right? I get to see the 0.01% teaching at Harvard Business School. I think there is something that is in the background and we haven't discussed, but this is the issue that endowments matter a lot in this life. And the community that you have grown up, the family that you're coming, the socioeconomic background and so forth are actually very important determinants of the type of education that you are getting and the opportunities that you're getting in your life. This is an unfortunate fact that I think we need to deal with. So I'm not worried that much about the education that everybody's getting. I'm seriously worried about the education that the bottom half of the population is getting. And if we don't get serious about discussing this issue, what you will see is inequality increasing in the future.
Lady Lynn, you're going to get the last word, but I'll tell you the single most depressing statistic I've heard, which is an affluent kid who does poorly in high school is more likely to graduate from college than a poor kid who does really well in high school.
Yeah. And a relevant statistic to the same is that if you're born in the bottom 20%, only 40% get out. If you're born in the top 20%, 60% will stay there. To the education point, I do think that it's talked about all the time, and I agreed with everything everyone said, but the institutions need to innovate. So today at Harvard, to get into an advanced math class, you have to master trigonometry. The practical use for trigonometry is land surveying, the job George Washington had. I mean, it's insane. Where probability is not something you have to master before you get into math at Harvard. So I think there's some innovation that could go on in our great institutions.
Please join me.
I didn't go to Harvard.